Our fourth session to start the day, economics and development. The past 60 years has seen a dramatic rise in living standards across the world, post-World War II. Nations that have strong economic growth are better able to reduce poverty rates, strengthen political stability, improve the quality of the natural environment, and even diminish the incidence of crime and violence, theoretically. The Tropics has outperformed the rest of the world in terms of economic growth over the past 30 years and now represents about 20% of global economic activity. But, and there's always a but, the best available data suggests that gross domestic product per capita in the Tropics is currently estimated to be only 1/3 that of the rest of the world. And that's a sobering thought. Good to congratulate, but never lose touch with reality. So with our next panel, and I'll introduce them and ask them to come up as I do introduce them, we're going to hear from each of them individually, and then with what time is left we'll have some quick discussion. Huw McKay is the Executive Director and Senior International Economist for Westpac. He joined their economic research team in 2000. He's the bank's spokesperson on Pan-Asian economic and market issues, and he was formerly a principal advisor in the macroeconomic group of the Federal Treasury, which is a pretty dynamic brains trust these days. Huw is going to talk on the Asian region and Northern Australia, long-run issues. Our next panellist, Alex de Waal, has extensive expertise in general management across a diverse range of industry sectors, including tourism, hospitality, manufacturing, construction, property and mining services. And as CEO of Tourism Tropical North Queensland currently, Alex provides destination development vision and leadership to the industry of one of Australia's most significant tourism destinations. And our third speaker this morning is pretty well known to you all, I'm sure, Keith de Lacy, one of Queensland's best-known company directors and public figures, Queensland President of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and sits on the National Board. Over the years, Keith has served as Chairman of Macarthur Coal, Queensland Sugar, Ergon Energy, the Cubby Group, CEC, Trinity Group and a host of others. He remains a Director of the Reef Casino and Queensland Energy Resources. And Keith was Queensland Treasurer from 1989 to 1996 and which will be the topic of what he's talking about today. He's presently Chairman of a consortium developing a massive integrated irrigated agricultural project on the Gilbert River system in far north Queensland with a capital cost estimated at $2 billion. Now, can I please ask Huw McKay to start proceedings? As I said, he's talking about the Asian region and Northern Australia, some long-run issues. Huw McKay.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much to Cairns Regional Council and the Mayor, JCU and the Vice-Chancellor, and to all the event sponsors, notably QTC, who really are responsible for getting me up to the Tropics as often as I do manage to come, particularly to advise councils in our north. Now, just to begin, an apology of sorts. In that if you're expecting to get an economic outlook of a very practical nature from me right now, that's not what you're about to receive. This is going to be very much the view from 30,000 feet and in the very long run, not just mid-century, end of century. I am on the panel afterwards, though, where I'm very, very happy to get involved in those short-run issues about interest rates and the currency and everything else. But this is a very, very different objective. Now, why have I done this? I've done it because there is a very considerable degree of uncertainty and thus disagreement about the future course of the world economy. Over the sorts of time horizons that are relevant to the choice and assessment of strategic multi-generational development decisions, when the political cycle or even a decade or two can appear trivial, even small disagreements on the future trajectory of economic growth can become very substantial disagreements on the future relative scale of nations. Large disagreements today indicate visions of the far-flung future that are so far apart that constructive policy debates in the here and now become almost pointless in their presence. So my objective today is to offer some guidance for this debate by presenting a suite of very high-level scenarios for a subset of all the major actors in the global economy, covering all of tropical Northern Australia's major trading partners. Now, these projections, a catalogue of 5 scenarios, are going to cover the major stylised positions that people seem to hold about Asia's future, China's future, India's future, etc., and to encapsulate them as briefly as one possibly can. Now, the time frame of 2100 may seem excessive to you. Seemed excessive to me when I first started to do it. But I think it is very, very important. Firstly, the Asian Century White Paper of the Australian Government, the Commonwealth Government, which came out relatively recently, it took the very easy way out in terms of the time frame that it chose. It chose to only go to 2025. Now, what's special about 2025? Well, it's long enough that you don't have to worry about the economic cycle, but it's short enough that you don't have to make any inconvenient judgments about where countries will ultimately reside in terms of living standards. So it's not really giving us a multi-generational planning structure. It was designed in a certain way, it was executed skillfully, but the terms of reference limited it as a strategic document. Secondly, studies that stop in 2040 or 2050, I know Queensland has a 30-year plan, but the intergenerational report, even the state of the tropics at mid-century, they all leave out something very, very significant. And that is that the demographic profiles of the world's major economies are drastically different in the second half of this century. And where people end up in terms of relative scale at 2050 may or may not have a relationship to where they finish at the end of the century. And when we plan multi-generationally, as we ought to, it is a major sin of omission to just cut things off at mid-century and say, that's that. Okay, so that's my agenda. I will proceed to describe the jumping off point, which are IMF projections. I use the IMF to take my personal biases out of the equation. An admission is that I think that the IMF has been too optimistic for basically since the financial crisis, so usually my own forecasts are slightly lower. But it's something I can take which is an objective set of numbers about where the world economy is going to be. I'll go through my scenarios following that, and then I'll draw out some implications for tropical Northern Australia. So as of the starting point, the US and developed Europe are basically the same size. They're about 1/4 of my sample, which represents about 4/5 of the world, slightly short of the G20, given that I don't think very carefully about Mexico and Argentina in these projections. China is about 1/5 of that total. Japan and India are both about 7. Russia and Brazil are both about 4. The ASEAN economies are about 5. Indonesia is about 2. Canada and South Korea are about the same size, and Australia is about 1.5. That's our basic starting point here. But by the end of the IMF projections, we actually have some important shifts in ranking already coming through by the end of the decade. China is going to be number 1 by the end of that period. It's going to surpass the US and developing Europe. India is going to leave Japan far behind. Korea is going to be edging away from Canada. And Indonesia is going to surpass Canada in the meantime. There are some considerable shifts before I even start using my own spreadsheet. Okay, so what are my scenarios? I've given them both a number and a name. The first one is a blue sky scenario. So number 1 is the blue sky. This is the most optimistic way I can describe the coming century. Everybody does well, everybody improves their living standards, everybody ends up relatively wealthy. So that's blue sky. That's the nice simple one that we hope will come through. The second is a scenario which is bullish on China but is bearish on the rest of Asia. So in this situation, China becomes wealthy, but Asia gets lost in its shadow. This is the one where the myopic Sinophiles have their optimism validated. The third is a situation where China struggles, but the rest of Asia does well. China bearish, Asia more broadly bullish. So this is where India gets wealthy, but China stagnates. And that's a very, very interesting scenario when you work your way through to the end of it, as I'll be illustrating in a moment. There's another one where everyone in Asia falls into the middle income trap, and the West maintain their position of very large relative affluence. And the fifth is grey skies for the West. Now, when I wrote that, I didn't realise how Tolkien-esque that sounded, but it is not gloomy, it's just relatively pessimistic in the sense that Asian countries catch up, but they're catching up to a West which is growing less quickly, and therefore it's a less impressive performance. Now, let's have a look at what some of these numbers actually look like. Sorry, I flicked too quickly over my disclaimer. Disclaimers are very important things for forecasters. Indeed. They're actually cracking down on font size now, which has made things more awkward. Usually one slide isn't enough. But in this instance, the degrees of uncertainty are enormous. That's why I'm not presenting to you a central tendency, which I think this is the most likely outcome. What I want you to do is actually look at these and say which one of these confirms most closely to my prior expectation of how these economies will perform. You can pick that one. You'll say, oh, that's roughly what things will look like if my basic biases about how the world will evolve do come through. And sometimes the numbers look a little bit different to what you thought. And I'll be illustrating an important special case of that particular point there. Now, this is the first scenario, the blue sky scenario. And you will see there that the red line in China completely dominates in the coming decades, but it actually peaks and starts to roll off around about the middle of the century, where that blue line, modelled on their one-day cricket uniforms, is India, who really does make up a considerable amount of ground in the second half of the century. And this is all about demographics, and I'll be going through this in a moment. The second scenario is where things get a little more interesting, because blue sky scenarios never eventuate. In this instance, this describes a world where China just does brilliantly well and everybody else suffocates behind the Chinese rise. But you will see even here, with Chinese growth not adjusted by population doing extraordinarily well, it still loses ground in the second half of the century. This is because China is already old. It is already ageing. And the arithmetic here is simple. It's numbers of people multiplied by their productivity level. And if the numbers of people are going backwards, your economic scale suffers, even if your living standards are very, very respectable indeed. Basically the Japanese situation, circa 2000. So this situation here holds Asia back. China dominates, but even under the best situation you can possibly envisage for the Chinese, they will be losing relative ground in the second half of this century. But then if you want to get bearish about the Chinese, but actually say, well, India's a democracy, so they're going to win in the long run, and there are many people who do make this case, you end up with India clearly sprinting ahead from mid-century and China falling well back to actually not even be number 2 by the end of the century and falling right back to somewhere around 4th. And this scenario here, which is where Asia struggles in every circumstance, this is the balance of power scenario. Now, a lot of people talk about a multipolar world coming out of the Cold War, where the US was unchallenged as number one. The rise of China and India just means that it's a multipolar world now, and it's a balanced world. The only way to actually achieve that, practically, is for Asia to fail in their development drives around the middle income level. That is the only way that China and India are not going to dominate in terms of economic scale going forwards. The only way is if Asia fails. Irrespective of what the West does, there has to be failure on the part of the East for the economic scale arithmetic to be so drastically altered to give us a balance of power scenario. Now, moving along, assessing these scenarios in the context of tropical northern Australia, and I have sympathy for you that I've just thrown a lot of numbers and a lot of pictures at you in a rush. This is where I distill the information. So, the most important takeaways from this scenario work for tropical northern Australia are arguably the following. The first is that China will be the world's largest economy for most of the time between the latter part of this decade and mid-century in every scenario, even the most pessimistic for China. Essentially, China's rise to number one in the first half of this century is now unarrestable, and it should not be contested. It's essentially happened already, and the first half of the century, you can argue, is completely over as a debating point. China's moment as a dominant power, without a near challenger in economic scale, will reach its zenith around 2040. But from 2040, when your grandchildren are starting to think about what university degree to get, China will have reached its zenith. Now, number two, in these scenarios, India finishes the century as the largest economy 3 times out of 5. India, the largest economy in the world, 3 times out of 5. The most likely outcome, then, is that India is the world's largest economy when we reconvene in 86 years. Now, and it's a close second in the other two. Now, this is because of the demographic profile. It is dramatically different to China's. And this creates an enormous edge in India's favour as the second half of the century comes underway. Now, there is a staggering fact that emanates from the scenario where the rest of Asia grows and China doesn't. Under that circumstance, at the end of the century, the Indian economy would be 3 times as large as the Chinese economy. 3 times as large. The magnitudes of the demographic differences are very considerable, and that is why I always take 2050 projections with a grain of salt, because it's really what happens after 2050 which South Asia is most interested in. East Asia loves what the first half of the century says about East Asia. South Asia likes what happens afterwards. So any vision of the world economy in the long run and of the trade, security, energy and food supply architecture that will evolve in the region more broadly and in tropical northern Australia, it needs to have a very well-defined position on India's preferences in the matter and not to be too concerned with China, where multi-generational planning is on the agenda. I've already talked a bit about the balance of power scenario. The balance of power scenario is the one that would prevent the fewest challenges to the status quo in terms of Australia's own defence arrangements and the constellation of defence capital and human capital in the north. And that is something which is very attractive, I think, to policymakers in the West. The balance of power sounds okay to them because it means the least amount of change, and change is always threatening. But there's a real sting here, and I've already referred to it, but the very clear inference from all of this work is that there's an inconsistent position which is actually held by a number of policymakers in Australia. I won't name names, but inside the planning infrastructure, there are a lot of people who claim to be bullish on Asian growth on the one hand, and over here they claim to believe in a balance of power scenario. The two are not compatible positions. People have been allowed to hold those two positions because no one's really done the numbers before. But you have to choose. You're either bullish on Asian growth and you believe in Asian dominance in economic scale, or you believe in the balance of power, but you also believe that Asia will peter out before too long. So our policymakers do have to choose. You can't be a member of both of those camps. Now, I haven't spoken much about Europe yet, but a key implication of these scenarios is that developed Europe never falls out of the world's top 4 economic regions in any of these scenarios. You can't forget Europe. It's having a dreadful time right now. But in terms of economic scale, it's a very, very dangerous omission to remove the European economy from any of your prognostications. It's going to be at least the 4th largest economy at the end of the century, just as it's very close to the top now. So don't exempt Europe. I know that's very convenient to do in the Asian century, but Europe's not going to disappear. Japan, though, will recede quite drastically in terms of its economic scale. The Japanese will remain a wealthy people, but its economy's size will be surpassed in every scenario by Indonesia, most scenarios by Brazil and Russia, on one occasion each by Canada and the Philippines, for goodness sake. The Philippines, whose latent potential has been basically untapped since the 1960s. Japan passed West Germany in the late 60s, the USSR in the mid-80s to become the world's 2nd largest economy, but it's fallen behind China, it's fallen behind India, and it's not going to reclaim that status. 6th takeaway. No economy outside the top 4 will comprise more than 6% of the world economy in 2100. Now, what is notable beyond that statement, though, is that Indonesia comes 5th most of the time. Indonesia is the most likely economy to be the 5th biggest economic zone in the world at the end of this century. I don't need to reiterate to this audience how important Indonesia is to tropical northern Australia. It will become even more important, and it will be a much bigger global player over this century than it has ever been. And this also gets me on to one of my particular hobby horses, which is the BRIC acronym, BRIC. It's just not relevant for long-run analysis, I'm afraid. It's a marketing gimmick, but we should steer away from talking about it too much. Now, this is not just because China and India are in a completely different league to Russia and Brazil in terms of economic scale. So it's not a group of equals to begin with. Indonesia will be a much bigger economic factor than either the B or the R. Indonesia is a very, very big deal. It's overshadowed by the billion people economies to its north and its northwest, but it's a huge deal, and to tropical northern Australia it will be even more important than it will be to the globe. 7. Old nations suffer in scale, young societies forge ahead. Very, very simple takeaway. And that's why the Philippines comes up again. And I actually think that the omission of the Philippines as a single unit of analysis in the Asian Century White Paper was a mistake. The Philippines is populous, it's fast-growing, it is resource-rich, it has underperformed for a considerable period of time, but I don't think it's an entity which we can ignore. it's also a tropical economy. I think the Philippines needs to get more focus, and if you actually walk around, say, the Charles Darwin campus sometime, you will see that the Philippines is already a very strong source of demand for Australian services exports, and it will continue to be so. So, summing up, because I'm sure time is racing, my objectives here were to offer a range of alternative futures of the world in the very long run, focused on the Asian region, and particularly on tropical Northern Australia's major trading partners. It's inescapable that the majority of the future demand for goods and services produced by this region will emanate from these countries. When I narrow that down, and the things that I really want you to remember from this talk are that China will dominate the first half of this century, but India will be a very, very major player indeed, at worst, in the second half. Indonesia will in all likelihood be the world's 5th largest economy at century's end. Japan, who's been a major source of demand for tropical Northern Australia over the last half-century, will recede somewhat into the background. The US and Europe are not going to disappear, but they're very, very unlikely to retain their current relative rankings. That's really a debate between China and India. And while demography is not destiny where the standard of living is concerned, it is destiny-like where the metric that you are focusing on is raw economic scale. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Huw. I have trouble thinking past next week, which is why I come to these conferences. It helps. One thing that you're kind of hinting at, but you don't really go to, and it's a topic for another, how long do you want? 3-day conference, 12 months, and that is the whole issue of geopolitics. And when I look at your lines intersecting there, and you see the great power of the 20th century moving down, and you see two of the great powers of the 21st century intersecting up. History tells us that when you have those kinds of tectonic shifts of power, you have war. And just to give you a little moment of pessimism, hopefully we're all too intelligent in the end for that to happen, but there is this thing called human nature. What are the odds of getting through a century without a substantial war along the way with those things intersecting? But you cannot, you certainly can't anticipate that one, but you can't exclude it.